April 23rd, 1945. The morning air hung thick with the smell of death and disinfectant as the 42nd Infantry Division's convoy rolled through the wrought iron gates of Dachau concentration camp. Corporal James Jimmy Hawthorne from Amarillo, Texas, had seen combat across France and into Bavaria, but nothing had prepared him for what lay beyond those gates. The young cowboy, barely 23 years old, had grown up herding cattle across the Panhandle Plains, where the horizon stretched endlessly and a man's word meant everything. His father had taught him to tip his hat to ladies, never strike a woman, and treat every human being with the dignity the good Lord intended. Those lessons felt like relics from another lifetime as he stepped off the transport truck and into what could only be described as hell on earth. Skeletal figures in striped uniforms stumbled toward the American liberators, their eyes hollow yet somehow still burning with the faint ember of hope. Some collapsed before reaching the soldiers, their bodies too weak to carry them another step. Jimmy's squad leader, Sergeant Michael O'Brien from Boston, barked orders to establish a perimeter and begin distributing medical supplies. But his voice cracked with emotion he couldn't quite conceal. The Nazi guards had fled or surrendered, leaving behind approximately 32,000 prisoners in various states of starvation and disease. According to military records documented by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, what the soldiers discovered that day would haunt them for the remainder of their lives: rail cars full of corpses, gas chambers disguised as showers, and human beings reduced to living skeletons. Jimmy moved through the camp in a daze, his rifle hanging loosely at his side. What good was a weapon against this kind of evil? The war was essentially over. Everyone knew it. Hitler would be dead within a week. But for these prisoners, the nightmare had lasted years, 12 brutal years since the camp's establishment in 1933. In one of the women's barracks, Jimmy paused at the doorway. The stench was overwhelming. Human waste, disease, and death mingled into something that burned his nostrils and throat. Wooden bunks stacked 3 high held multiple women each, barely enough space for their emaciated bodies. Some were already dead, their bunkmates too weak to move them. That's when he first saw her. She sat alone on the lowest bunk near the far wall, her shaved head revealing the sharp angles of her skull, her striped uniform hanging off her frame like a child wearing her father's coat. But her eyes, dear God, her eyes, they weren't whole like the others. They blazed with something Jimmy couldn't quite identify. Rage, defiance, recognition of her own humanity despite everything designed to strip it away. She stared directly at him, and Jimmy Hawthorne, who had never backed down from a fight in his life, found himself frozen in place. This woman, whoever she was, held him captive with her gaze alone. He didn't know it yet, but her name was Marguerite Schneider. She was 28 years old, and she was about to change his understanding of courage, survival, and what it meant to be truly human. The moments stretched between them like a taut wire. And then, something impossible happened. She smiled. 1937 had been the last good year of Marguerite Schneider's life. She had been a schoolteacher in Munich, unmarried but content, living in a modest apartment near the Isar River. She taught literature and music to children aged 10 to 14, and her students adored her passionate readings of Goethe and Schiller. Her father owned a small printing business. Her mother kept a garden that produced the finest tomatoes in their neighborhood. But Marguerite had made a fatal mistake. In Nazi Germany, she had a conscience. When Jewish families began disappearing from her school, when children she taught for years suddenly had empty desks, she had asked questions. When she was told to remove certain books from her classroom, works by Jewish authors, political dissidents, anyone the right deemed undesirable, she had hesitated long. When a fellow teacher reported seeing her slip bread to the Goldstein family hiding in their cellar, her fate was sealed. The Gestapo came for her in November 1938, just days after Kristallnacht. They labeled her an enemy of the state, a sympathizer, a traitor to the German people. There was no trial, no judge, no opportunity to defend herself. According to documentation later compiled by the Dachau concentration camp memorial site, thousands of political prisoners, communists, socialists, intellectuals, clergy, and ordinary citizens who dared to question the regime were swept into the concentration camp system during those dark years. Marguerite spent 7 years in Dachau, 7 years of forced labor in the camp's industrial workshops, 7 years of starvation rations, watery soup, and a piece of bread that felt like concrete, 7 years of watching friends die from typhus, tuberculosis, or simply giving up, 7 years of being designated for the special treatment that Nazi guards inflicted on female prisoners, though she refused to speak of those details even decades later. But Marguerite Schneider had discovered something the Nazis couldn't extinguish. Her will to witness. If she survived, she would tell the world. She memorized names of the dead, whispered them to herself each night like a prayer. She made mental notes of the guards' faces, their crimes, their casual cruelty. She became a living archive of atrocity. When the American corporal stepped into her barracks that April morning, she recognized what he couldn't yet see in himself, a fundamental decency that still existed in the world. His eyes held horror at what surrounded him, but not disgust at the prisoners themselves. He looked at them as people, not as the undermentioned subhumans the Nazis had labeled them. That distinction, subtle but profound, made Marguerite smile. Not from happiness. She had forgotten what happiness felt like, but from recognition. Here was a human being who still possessed his humanity intact. Jimmy approached slowly, carefully, as if he feared she might bolt like a wild animal. His weathered hands reached into his field jacket and produced a chocolate bar, slightly melted from body heat. He held it out to her, and when she didn't move, he came closer, lowering himself to one knee so they were eye level. "Ma'am," he said softly, his Texas drawl thick with emotion. "I'm sorry we took so long getting here." Marguerite blinked. The chocolate bar trembled in his outstretched hand. After 7 years of nothing but cruelty from men, this stranger was offering her sweetness and an apology. Her skeletal fingers reached out, but instead of taking the chocolate, she touched his hand. Just touched it. Felt the warmth of living flesh, the calluses from honest work, the slight tremor of a young man trying desperately not to fall apart at what he was witnessing. "Thank you," she whispered in German accent in English, words she'd learned from her father's business dealings before the war. The medics arrived within the hour, overwhelmed and unprepared. First Lieutenant Robert Kellerman, a field surgeon from Philadelphia, had set up a triage station in what had once been the camp's administrative building. He and his team worked frantically, but the medical challenges were staggering. According to the Historical Division of the United States Army's official reports, the 7th Army discovered that thousands of prisoners required immediate medical attention for typhus, tuberculosis, dysentery, and advanced starvation. Jimmy Hawthorne found himself assigned to one of the recovery teams, responsible for helping prisoners to the medical stations. He had no medical training beyond basic battlefield first aid, but he had the strong arms and a determination not to let another single person die on his watch. He kept returning to Marguerite's barracks. Other soldiers noticed but said nothing. Each man dealt with the horror in his own way. Some threw themselves into the logistics of food distribution. Others documented evidence with cameras. Knowing the world would need proof of what had happened here, a few simply sat down and wept, unable to process what they'd witnessed. Jimmy's way was Marguerite. He learned her name on the second day. She spoke it clearly, with dignity, as if the name still belonged to her and hadn't been stripped away along with everything else. He practiced the pronunciation, Margarete, rolling the German syllables around his Texas tongue until he got it right. She corrected him gently, and something like amusement flickered in her eyes. "Your name?" she asked, her English halting but determined. "James Hawthorne, ma'am, but everybody calls me Jimmy." "Jimmy," she repeated, making it sound almost musical despite her weakened state. By the third day, Jimmy had commandeered a wheelchair, one of the few available, and began taking Marguerite outside. The April sunshine felt obscene somehow, too beautiful for a place of such darkness, but he watched her face tilt upward toward the warmth, like a flower seeking light. She had been a teacher, she told him. She loved Beethoven and wildflowers and the way mountains looked at sunset. Small details emerged, puzzle pieces of a life that had existed before the nightmare. Jimmy listened intently, committing every word to memory, and in exchange, he told her about Texas, about wide-open spaces and summer thunderstorms that rolled across the plains like freight trains, about his family's ranch and his mother's peach cobbler and the way coyotes sang to the moon. They were translating more than language. They were translating their souls, finding common ground in the fundamental human experiences that transcended war, nationality, and incomprehensible cruelty. On the fifth day, Marguerite's condition began to improve. The medics had warned about refeeding syndrome. Giving starving prisoners too much food too quickly could actually kill them. Under careful supervision, she was receiving small, controlled portions of nutritious food and intravenous fluids to restore her electrolyte balance. "I will live," she told Jimmy matter-of-factly. "I promised myself I would survive to tell the truth about this place." "You'll tell it," Jimmy assured her. "I'll make sure people listen." But it was on the sixth day that everything changed. A Red Cross worker approached Jimmy with a clipboard and a grim expression. They had been processing prisoner records, trying to identify survivors and locate any living family members. Marguerite's file told a story even more harrowing than Jimmy had imagined. She hadn't just been a political prisoner. According to records the Nazis themselves had meticulously kept, Marguerite Schneider had been designated for the camp brothel, a special building where select prisoners were forced to provide sexual services to other prisoners as a reward system and to the guards themselves. The Nazis called these women comfort women, a euphemism that barely concealed the horror of systematic rape. Jimmy sat outside the barracks for nearly an hour after reading Marguerite's full file, his back against the wooden wall, his head in his hands. The Texas sky he described to her seemed impossibly distant. The moral clarity he carried into this war, good versus evil, allies versus enemies, had shattered into 1,000 complicated pieces. The camp brothel, officially called the Sonderbaden Special Buildings, had been documented in Nazi records with characteristic bureaucratic precision. According to research later published by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, Heinrich Himmler had approved the establishment of camp brothels in 1942 as part of an incentive system for prisoner productivity. Women from Ravensbrück concentration camp were initially transferred to various camps, including Dachau, and forced into sexual slavery under threat of death. Marguerite had endured this for 3 years. Sergeant O'Brien found Jimmy outside and sat down beside him without speaking. After several minutes of silence, the older man finally said, "You read her file." "Yeah, and you're wondering how to look at her now." Jimmy's jaw tightened. "I'm wondering how she's still sane. I'm wondering how she can smile. I'm wondering." His voice broke. "I'm wondering what kind of God allows something like that to happen." O'Brien lit a cigarette, offered one to Jimmy, who declined. "My wife's cousin survived the camps in Poland," O'Brien said quietly. "Auschwitz. When he finally made it to America last year, you know what he told me? He said the people who survived weren't necessarily the strongest or the smartest. They were the ones who found a reason to see tomorrow, even when tomorrow looked just like yesterday, even when tomorrow meant more horror. She told me she survived to tell the truth," Jimmy said. "Then help her tell it." Jimmy found Marguerite that afternoon sitting outside her barracks, her face turned toward the sun. She'd gained perhaps 2 pounds, barely noticeable on her skeletal frame, but her eyes seemed clearer, more focused. When she saw him approaching, her expression shifted subtly. She knew. "You read the Nazi records," she stated, not asked. Jimmy sat beside her, maintaining a careful distance. "Yes, ma'am. And now you see me differently." "No." The word came out fierce, almost angry. He took a breath and continued more softly. "I see the Nazis differently. I see what they did to you, what they took from you. But you, Miss Marguerite, you're still the bravest person I've ever met." She turned to look at him fully then, searching his face for dishonesty or pity. Finding neither, she nodded slowly. "Many soldiers cannot look at us after they learn. The women from the special buildings. We are contaminated in their eyes, ruined. That's their shame, not yours. You say this now, but when you return to Texas, when you tell your family about the war, you will not tell them about me. You will not tell them about the comfort women. It is too uncomfortable for the heroes to acknowledge." Jimmy was quiet for a long moment. She was right, and they both knew it. The liberation of the concentration camps was already being framed as a triumph of American righteousness over Nazi evil. The complicated realities, the years of inaction, the refugees turned away at borders, the systematic sexual violence, those stories would be buried beneath the cleaner narrative of military victory. "I want to tell them," he finally said. "I want people to know what you survived. Not just the camp, not just the starvation, all of it, the whole truth." "Why?" Marguerite asked, genuinely curious. "Why does a cowboy from Texas care about a German teacher's suffering?" "Because you matter," Jimmy said simply. "Because what happened to you matters. Because if we don't tell the whole truth, if we clean it up and make it easier to swallow, then we'll forget. And if we forget, we'll let it happen again." April 30th, 1945 arrived with news that Adolf Hitler had died by suicide in his bunker in Berlin. Throughout Dachau, the announcement was met with grim satisfaction but little celebration. For the survivors, Hitler's death changed nothing about their suffering. It couldn't bring back the dead or restore the years stolen from them. Jimmy had been at the camp for exactly 1 week. In that time, he'd helped transport hundreds of survivors to medical facilities, distributed thousands of rations, and documented evidence that would later be used in the Nuremberg trials. but he'd spend every spare moment with Marguerite, learning her story, helping her regain strength, and slowly, carefully, becoming her friend. The army had begun making preparations to transfer prisoners to proper hospitals and displaced persons camps. Recovery would take months, even years. Survivors needed not just medical care, but legal assistance, housing, job training, and help locating any surviving family members. The scope of the humanitarian crisis was unprecedented. On the morning of May 1st, Jimmy arrived at Marguerite's barracks to find her actually standing without assistance, for the first time since liberation. She'd gained nearly 5 pounds, still desperately thin, but no longer skeletal. Her hair had begun growing back, a soft dark fuzz covering her scalp. Most remarkably, she wore different clothes, a simple dress provided by the Red Cross. Too large for her frame, but infinitely better than the striped uniform she'd worn for 7 years. "I am going to the memorial service," she announced. The Army chaplain, Captain David Rosenbaum, had organized a service to honor the prisoners who had died before liberation. It would be held in the assembly area where the Nazis had conducted roll calls, where prisoners had stood for hours in all weather while being counted and recounted. According to military reports, approximately 1,500 prisoners had died in the days immediately before and after liberation, their bodies too broken to recover. "I'll walk with you," Jimmy offered. The assembly area filled with hundreds of survivors, American soldiers, Red Cross workers, and military officials. Captain Rosenbaum, himself Jewish and visibly shaken by what he'd witnessed at the camp, led prayers in English, German, and Hebrew. Survivors recited the names of the dead, a seemingly endless litany of murdered souls. Jimmy stood slightly behind Marguerite, close enough to catch her if she fell, far enough to give her dignity. When the service reached its conclusion and the chaplain called for a moment of silence, something extraordinary happened. Marguerite began to tremble, not from weakness or cold, but from something deeper. 7 years of suppressed grief finally breaking through the walls she built to survive. Her shoulders shook, and a sound emerged from her throat, a wail of such profound anguish that everyone within 20 feet turned toward her. Jimmy didn't consider military protocol or social conventions or the dozens of eyes suddenly focused on them. He simply stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against his chest as she collapsed into sobs that seemed to come from the very center of the earth. The entire assembly area fell silent. Time suspended itself in that moment. Later, witnesses would struggle to articulate exactly what they'd seen, why it affected them so profoundly. On the surface, it was simply a soldier comforting a survivor, nothing unusual given the circumstances. The Americans had been embracing liberated prisoners all week, offering human comfort after years of inhuman treatment. But this was different. Everyone felt it. Perhaps it was the stark contrast. Jimmy Hawthorne in his clean American uniform, tall and strong and healthy, holding Marguerite Schneider, who barely weighed 90 pounds, who wore the physical evidence of Nazi brutality on every inch of her body. Perhaps it was the tenderness with which he held her, his large, weathered hands cradling her shaved head as if she were made of porcelain, his face pressed against her temple, his own shoulders beginning to shake with suppressed emotion. Or perhaps it was what they represented. Jimmy embodied the promise that had sustained prisoners through years of hell, that somewhere beyond the barbed wire, decent people still existed, that the world hadn't entirely surrendered to darkness, that someone would come, eventually, and bear witness to their suffering. Marguerite embodied something equally powerful, survival despite everything designed to destroy it. She was proof that the human spirit could endure the unendurable, that the Nazis had failed in their ultimate goal of dehumanization. She stood in that assembly area, broken but breathing, destroyed but still standing, as living testimony to the resilience of hope. According to a letter later written by Sergeant Michael O'Brien to his wife in Boston, now preserved in the Imperial War Museum's archives, what struck him most was the absolute silence that fell over the assembly area. You had hundreds of people standing there, survivors who'd been shouting, soldiers who'd been talking, officials moving around, and suddenly everyone just stopped. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. We all just stood there watching this cowboy from Texas hold this German woman, like she was the most precious thing in the world. And maybe in that moment, she was. Captain Rosenbaum later wrote in his chaplain's report that he'd intended to conclude the service with a final blessing, but found himself unable to speak. The embrace said everything words couldn't. It was blessing and benediction, apology and acknowledgement, grief and grace all rolled into one achingly human moment. The silence stretched. 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes of absolute stillness in a place that had known nothing but noise and chaos and cruelty for 12 years. Jimmy held Marguerite through the entire duration of her collapse, never loosening his grip, never showing the slightest indication that he wanted to let go. He whispered something to her, words only she could hear, and she nodded against his chest, her fingers clutching his uniform jacket with desperate strength. And then, gradually, the sound returned. A survivor began to weep, then another. Soon dozens of people were crying openly, releasing emotions they'd suppressed for years because showing weakness meant death in the camps. The Americans weren't immune either. Hardened combat soldiers who fought their way across Europe found tears streaming down their faces, and for once, no one tried to hide them. When Marguerite finally pulled back from Jimmy's embrace, she looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes and said loud enough for those nearby to hear, "Thank you for seeing me. Not the prisoner, not the comfort woman, not the number the Nazis gave me. Marguerite, I see you, Jimmy." Confirmed, his voice rough with emotion. "I'll always see you." The embrace lasted less than 5 minutes, but its impact rippled outward in ways no one could have predicted. In the days following the memorial service, something shifted in the camp's atmosphere. Soldiers who had been maintaining professional distance from survivors began allowing themselves to connect more deeply. Survivors who had hidden their emotions, still operating under the camp rules that equated vulnerability with death, began permitting themselves to grieve openly. Jimmy and Marguerite's relationship became something of a legend. Within the 42nd Infantry Division, men who had witnessed the embrace found themselves sharing the story with other units, and from there it spread through the military grapevine with the speed that only significant moments achieve. "Did you hear about the Texan who held the comfort woman?" Soldiers would ask each other. "Did you hear how the whole field went silent?" But the story didn't remain confined to the military. Red Cross worker Elizabeth Manning from Chicago wrote about the incident in her journal, which was later published as part of a collection of first-hand accounts titled Witnesses to Liberation in 1948. "In all my years of humanitarian work," Manning wrote, "I never witnessed a more profound demonstration of human compassion. That young soldier taught us all what it means to truly see another person's humanity, even when that humanity has been systematically denied." War correspondent Martha Gellhorn, who had entered Dachau with the American troops, referenced the incident in one of her dispatches, though she didn't use real names. "I saw a soldier embrace a survivor at the memorial service," she wrote in a piece published in Collier's Weekly in June 1945. "In that embrace was everything we're supposed to be fighting for: the recognition of human dignity, the refusal to let evil define the victims of evil, the simple act of bearing witness without judgment." The embrace affected military policy too, though subtly. Medical staff began receiving instructions to treat trauma more holistically, to recognize that survivors needed emotional healing as much as physical restoration. Chaplains like Captain Rosenbaum started organizing more memorial services and counseling sessions, creating spaces for grief in a military environment that typically discouraged emotional displays. For Marguerite, the embrace represented a turning point. In the weeks that followed, she began speaking more freely about her experiences, not just to Jimmy, but to the documenting officers gathering evidence for war crimes trials. Her testimony would later prove crucial in prosecuting several Dachau guards and administrators. She described the school where she taught, the students she loved. The moment the Gestapo had arrived, she detailed the conditions in the camp, the forced labor, the systematic starvation. And yes, she spoke about the special building, the comfort women, the ways the Nazis had weaponized sexuality as another form of torture and control. According to transcripts preserved in the National Archives and Records Administration, Marguerite's testimony was among the most detailed and damning. She named names, provided dates, described specific incidents with a teacher's precision for detail. The memory training that had helped her survive now served justice. Jimmy attended every testimony session, sitting in the back of the room, never interrupting, just being present. His presence gave Marguerite strength, reminded her that someone believed her. Someone bore witness to her witness. In mid-May, the Army began processing discharge paperwork for soldiers with sufficient service points. Jimmy Hawthorne qualified to go home. The war in Europe had officially ended on May 8th, and while fighting continued in the Pacific, Jimmy's unit wouldn't be redeployed there. He'd done his duty. He could return to Texas, to his family's ranch, to the life he left behind when he'd enlisted 3 years earlier. He didn't want to go. "You must," Marguerite insisted when he told her about his discharge orders. You have a family waiting for you, a life to return to. What about your life? Jimmy asked. What happens to you now? Marguerite Schneider spent the next 8 months in displaced persons camps, recovering physically and beginning the impossible task of rebuilding a life from nothing. Her parents had died during the war, her father of a heart attack in 1941, her mother of pneumonia in 1943. Her apartment in Munich had been destroyed in a live bombing. Every photograph, every letter, every physical reminder of her pre-war existence was gone. But she had her memories, and she had a promise. Jimmy Hawthorne returned to Amarillo, Texas in July 1945. His family welcomed him home with tears and celebration, grateful their son had survived when so many hadn't. But the young man who came back wasn't the same one who left. He'd seen things, experienced things that changed a person fundamentally. He couldn't speak about it at first. How do you explain Dachau to people eating homemade peach cobbler? How do you describe skeletal prisoners to folks whose biggest concern is whether there'd be enough rain for the cattle? The worlds were incompatible, impossible to reconcile. But Jimmy tried. Slowly, carefully, he began telling his family about the camp, about the conditions, about the survivors, and about Marguerite. His mother, Sarah Hawthorne, listened with increasing tears. That poor woman, she kept saying. That poor, brave woman. She's not looking for pity, Jimmy said. She's looking for someone to remember, someone to make sure the world knows what happened. Then we'll remember, his father declared. We'll tell everyone who'll listen. And they did. Jimmy spoke at his church, at the Rotary Club, at the high school he'd attended. The story of his encounter with Marguerite became central to his testimony, not because it was dramatic or romantic, but because it illustrated something essential about human connection and dignity. According to archived copies of the Amarillo Globe News from late 1945, Jimmy's talks drew significant attention. Local veteran describes camp horrors read one headline. The article quoted Jimmy extensively. We can't let people forget what happened over there. We can't clean it up and make it comfortable. The truth is uncomfortable, and it should be. Meanwhile, in Germany, Marguerite began her own form of testimony. She returned to teaching, working in schools for displaced children and orphans. She wrote extensively about her experiences, contributing to early Holocaust documentation projects. Her articles appeared in German and international publications, unflinching accounts of concentration camp realities that many readers found difficult to process. In 1947, an American publisher contacted Jimmy. They were compiling a book of soldier testimonies from the liberation of the camps and wanted to include his story. Jimmy agreed on one condition: they had to include Marguerite's perspective too. Give equal weight to the survivors' voice and the liberators. The publisher arranged for correspondence between Jimmy and Marguerite. Their letters, initially focused on the book project, gradually became personal. They wrote about their daily lives, their struggles to readjust to peace, their shared determination to ensure the world never forgot. In spring 1949, Jimmy traveled back to Germany. He'd saved money from ranch work, taken vacation time, and booked passage on a ship bound for Europe. He told his parents he needed to see how survivors were rebuilding, but everyone knew the real reason. The reunion between Jimmy and Marguerite took place in Munich, in a small cafe near the Marienplatz. She'd gained weight, looked healthy, though the shadows never entirely left her eyes. He dazed too, weathered further by Texas sun and the weight of memories. They sat across from each other, awkward at first, then gradually falling into the easy communication they'd established during those intense days at Dachau. You kept your promise, Marguerite said. People are listening. So did you, Jimmy replied. You survived. You're telling the truth. Their relationship never became romantic in the conventional sense. The trauma Marguerite had endured made certain forms of intimacy impossible, and Jimmy never pushed, never expected anything beyond the profound friendship they'd forged. But they remained in each other's lives, writing regularly, visiting when possible, each serving as the other's anchor to that transformative moment when a